I'm Dave Shackleford, for those of you that might not have been around yesterday. Most of you probably were. And I'm going to be kicking us off this morning with, I'm going to steal from Ben yesterday, right? I'm going to start off with the worst talk of the day. It's only going to get better from here, right? So, who knows, maybe that's true. But the reality is this talk is really, in some ways, less of a talk and more of some interesting data. And so for those of you that don't know, just about every year and a half-ish, depending on whether we can get our schedules together, SANS does a survey on cloud security. And we go out to the community, folks just like you, and we just ask some questions. What's happening out there? What are you guys doing? What's happening with your company, your organizations? Are you guys moving to the cloud? If so, what are you doing? And of course, focused on security, what are some of the headaches that you're experiencing? What are some of the wins you might be experiencing too? What are the things that you're doing better than you might have been doing before? So it's all about the sort of holistic view of cloud, particular to security, but it's coming from the community perspective. And so what I want to do is relate to you guys some of the major points that we found this year. So you guys are, of course, getting the first preview of this. We're going to be doing a webcast, actually 2 webcasts on this over the course of the next week, but you guys get it first. And so this is the first time I have an opportunity to get up and talk to everybody about some of the things that we found this year as we came back. And so this is my Captain Obvious slide for the day. We've seen an emphasis on attacks in the cloud. And it's not so much because the cloud is insecure necessarily. I'll talk a little bit more about that. It's because any surface area that people significantly start shifting towards is going to draw the attention of attackers. So that's all that's really going on. And of course, alongside that, we've got some interesting factors, really just looking at people not maybe knowing what they're doing in terms of configuration, not necessarily realizing some of the assets they have in the cloud. I don't need to tell everybody that we've had a lot of exposed S3 buckets over the past few years. It's the gift that keeps on giving. But we've also got new things that have started cropping up over the course of the last, let's call it 18 months or so, that I think show a little deeper element of security misconfiguration and perhaps just lack of awareness. Just last year, there was a whole bunch of open Kubernetes APIs that got exposed and, in fact, got hijacked. Some of you guys might have read about this. Some pretty big-name companies, in fact, were a part of this, where they had opened up these Kubernetes APIs. People basically jumped in there and started, crypto mining stuff and took some money from them. So if you don't know what you have, obviously you're going to have problems. And that list keeps on going. Microsoft had a pretty big outage, blah, 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 list goes on. However, this is not a doom and gloom talk. This is a talk just to say, look, given the fact that, number one, we've got more use of cloud than ever before, we've got more data and assets in the cloud, we've also got a lot of huge, just explosive growth across the cloud providers themselves. More cloud providers, more assets, more customers means more places to attack. We're going to see some pretty interesting things shaking out of this. And so just to start off, a little bit of demographics. I tried to sort of crunch this down. We had a really good mix. I'll just sort of leave it at that. We had a very broad representation of different verticals and different types of industries. I saw a little bit of an uptick in 2 spaces particularly this year. Number one, we saw more government agencies responding to us, which it shouldn't surprise anybody that government agencies want to make use of cloud as well. But we definitely saw them coming and actively responding and participating in some of our survey instruments this year, which was cool. The other one was a significant uptick in smaller businesses and organizations, which to me is really one of the major hallmarks of cloud adoption becoming more mature. If it's only big, massive enterprises, multi-billion-dollar industries that are global in scale, that's one end of the spectrum. But until we sort of get everybody along for the ride, we're not going to really be able to say, well, cloud is officially here for everybody. So that was another big one that we saw. Most of the responses came from the US, Europe, and Asia. We definitely saw some other things from pretty much all the different places aside from Antarctica. So some key findings. A couple things that I wanted to point out, and I won't read these slides to you. I have a bad tendency when I deliver data points to folks. I just smack a bunch of stuff up on a slide. You guys will get a copy of all these later, so you can gaze upon this to your heart's content. But I'll just draw some of the highlights. Number one, we saw that people did, in fact, get attacked in the cloud. I mean, I'll get to that here in just a bit. But we did see an increase in unauthorized access coming back. People that knew that they had had some form of unauthorized access. So only 19% said that they had something about this going on in 2017. Towards the end of that was when we had our last survey. This year we saw that that had gone up to roughly a third of the organizations that we polled. We also saw over 55% said that they were still just really struggling to get some of the log data and to just deal with that. Now, for those of you that were here yesterday and you heard a lot of the really awesome discussions and presentations that were given, the term CloudTrail came up a lot. We talked a lot about logs and events around the cloud control planes. I think that's great, but I think people are still struggling on how to deal with it all and how to take that data, distill it, make it meaningful, turn it into artifacts and things that they can make use of as part of their investigations. Again, I'll get to that here in just a few minutes. And the final one was really more about risk and auditing for people that are looking at cloud providers in the first place. And we had to ask this just to say, hey, if you've got to go vet a provider, a third party, as part of your, call it just overall, partner evaluation or your vendor risk management programs, what are you looking at primarily to get a sense of how good a job they're doing? And we had a fairly flat answer set, which I'll get to at the very end of the presentation. But at the top of the list was ISO 27001. And I think that's predominantly due to, I'd say maturity to some degree. I think maturity in that area, it's just a standard that's been around a long time. But it's also one of the more internationally recognized standards, and that has a lot to do with things. So let's talk about what people are doing in the cloud in the first place. So to start us off, we always ask, what kinds of apps are you using? What kinds of services are you using in the cloud? Because if you hang out and you talk to people about cloud in general, especially even in here, just even from what we discussed yesterday, you might be led to believe that it's all Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. And the fact of the matter is, that's a much smaller percentage of cloud use than most realize, or at least tend to think about on a day-to-day basis. In fact, I've seen varying statistics that are out there, but for most, if you say cloud, it's SaaS. It's software as a service applications that people might have dozens of. In some organizations that I work with, hundreds of different types of software as a service applications. So it's much easier for a small organization in particular to make their initial foray into cloud by signing up for Office 365, or going and spinning some things up in Salesforce, or going and making use of Box for cloud storage. So we wanted to find out what kinds of things people were using, and this was a surprise, because in our last survey, we had, 84% came and said, yeah, we're using these, sort of workforce types of apps, business applications, and a lot fewer specifically noted those this year. They came back and said they were using a lot of storage. Some other sorts of security services were much bigger. I don't know if this one, I'm going to take as gospel. It might have just been the respondent set that we got in this particular case. You never know until we have a couple years of that data under our belts. But that drop was really surprising to me, because most of the clients that I work with, both large and small, are definitely making use of some of that type of different type of applications. So server virtualization, almost half. So server virtualization, of course, is instance workloads that you might spin up in Amazon or Azure or Google Cloud Platform. And I think you could probably extrapolate that out to things like containers and those types of workloads as well. We didn't really specifically focus on that. But that's encouraging to see people feeling comfortable enough to say, hey, half of us are willing to go put our own servers and workloads out of the cloud and do something with that. So a pretty broad set of different types of services, certain types of business apps, obviously storage and archival of storage, server virtualization, and then, again, about half, close to half, we're using different types of security services in the cloud as well, which I think is also a massive shift. So the whole realm of security as a service really has only arisen as a need to accommodate gaps that we might not have been able to put in place, controls for things that we're normally used to. If you can't take it with you and put it into the cloud, that's where security as a service types of offerings might be able to fill those gaps and help out. And we didn't get into too much specificity yet. I'll get to more of this in just a little bit. There's certainly more to say about that. A couple more stats on cloud use, just looking at how many different types of providers people are using. This was definitely also something I found interesting. The majority are still around 2 to 3. So just across the spectrum, 2 to 3 providers of all sorts sort of feels right. But we had a higher percentage that came back and said, a very, again, smaller percentage actually, saying that they were using one provider. So it only went down by 1 percentage point. So I don't really take that to mean a whole lot. But the last one I thought was interesting. More than 20 providers almost doubled. Still a small number, but you're seeing people more willing to go sign up for more types of services. I know yesterday in some of the talks that people were giving, there was some discussion around the use of multiple cloud providers. Multi-cloud is sort of becoming the norm for a variety of reasons, whether that's for backup and continuity, whether that's simply for different types of capabilities that they might offer. You really need something that's in Google Cloud versus what's in Amazon, for example, whether it's cost savings, whether it's just different stuff, who knows. But I think that number is going to grow significantly, because especially when you take into account things like SaaS, that's going to get a lot bigger and probably a lot faster. So this is my sort of short way of saying people are getting a lot more comfortable about putting sensitive data into the cloud. Is anybody surprised by this at all? Is anybody surprised that we're getting a lot more comfortable with the idea of taking sensitive data of a variety of types and putting it into a third-party arrangement? Anybody? Shock? Horror? Yeah, I don't know, maybe. But it depends on the type, too. So if you look at the types of data that people are most willing, I mean, business intelligence, intellectual property means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I strongly wager that, there's probably some threshold or limits that people are sort of, like, no, we're not going to do this. But if you go down this list, customer personal information, financial and accounting data, sure, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's going to grow. And we didn't necessarily ask this in conjunction with this question, but I think it's to be at least somewhat assumed there's a better comfort level. And maybe that's not necessarily even from the security side, it's from the business risk side. Somebody in your organization is cool with putting that data out into the cloud, and if they have the ability to make that call, they might do it. So what that tells us as security folks is that we've got to go along for the ride and ensure that we're doing everything we can to protect that. So something we already know. And in conjunction with that question, we just wanted to find out whether privacy was a factor. And another one that I don't think is probably a surprise, looking at things like GDPR, looking at some of the major privacy regulations that have cropped up, over half said yes, and a couple just weren't sure in general. But if you take that, I mean, I would probably say that many of the unknowns are hedging their bets, but probably have something to worry about here. You're getting close to roughly 2/3 of the respondents that came back and said, yeah, privacy is a factor for us. And there's some fascinating things that go along with this, too. Not to wax philosophic up here, but geographic regional specificity has a lot to do with the choice of some of the cloud providers that you'll find out there. For instance, some of you guys may be familiar that there is actually an entire continent called Africa. You guys have heard of it? Yeah, so Africa has extraordinarily low numbers of points of presence with all of the major providers. So if you go and look across the big three, the Google, the Microsoft, the Amazon, and then go check out the different regional offerings that might be available in South Africa or Central Africa or even the Northern African region, it's a ghost town. Why? Well, because they haven't felt the need to put anything there yet. That's changing. And part of the reason that it's changing is due to a significant growth in local and country-specific privacy laws that are starting to crop up there. So Microsoft has some stuff there. Amazon and Google are sort of making their move into that region as well. I'm just using it as an example. But if you're a global organization that happens to have business in one of those areas, that's something that you've got to take into account when you choose a provider. I always tell a story in some of my classes about a client of mine. And you'll appreciate this, I think, just for how weird it is. Nobody could have predicted this. But I've got a client, huge international retail company, that several years ago decided to choose Amazon as their infrastructure as a service provider. No shocker. But they chose London as their European region. Now, pause for a minute and ask yourself, what's the problem with that right now? Yep, they didn't think about that. And of course, nobody could have. So they're actually, right now, having to go through a significant migration of data out of that location into one of Amazon's EU-specific locations over there. So they're looking at, Frankfurt. They're looking at other places just because they know that might not be something that they can rely on down the road. So again, it's interesting to see how different regions and some of the even political elements play into this. Let's get into some of the security elements of this. And this is where we start talking about what's changing out there, what's happening with some of the folks that have been going out to the cloud and what they've been able to find. We wanted to find out whether folks were using some of the sort of later, better technologies that have emerged to facilitate cloud use. And really each one of these could be its own topic in its own right. But we asked about things like federated identity as a service. We talked about multi-cloud brokers, just because we've seen this adoption of multiple cloud providers that has sort of plagued people if they didn't plan for it. We talked about things like CASBs, Cloud Access Security Brokers, which is a whole security as a service brokering, primarily for SaaS services, but that's grown a bit to facilitate access to and control of data to platform and infrastructure services as well. And then we also asked about cloud network access services. So this is things like your Zscalers and sort of that access model for networking, not so much just for software as a service or application access. And right there at the top of the list, you can see the cloud network access, and we got some responses back from people too, where they were able to put in, sort of their own entries. There is a big shift to using the cloud as a connectivity mechanism for employees. In fact, there's a massive shift away from traditional VPN technologies. So you're seeing that end user sort of focus coming into play here. If you've got people that travel and maybe they have their own laptops, their own tablets, their own mobile devices, people are trying to get away from having to maintain centralized core services that everybody has to connect back to get to other places that they're going. I'm not saying that's happening wholesale, but I'm definitely seeing a move away, at least in some cases, from some of those types of traditional central hub and spoke architectural models for end user types of connectivity. I think the big one, though, just identity. You cannot really architect cloud services, whether for end users or core services or both, without having a massive emphasis on identity services of some types. And particularly for sort of taking things like Active Directory or directory type services and brokering those out into other places, it's becoming almost a mainstay that that's happening. So that's not surprising to see that close to half of the respondents said that they were making use of those types of services too. So this is another one where I think we're going to see some significant growth over time, just seeing that use of services like that. And we had a handful of other ones that sort of came in as well. Looking at the different types of things people were worried about in the cloud, and I'll come back to controls, by the way. I have a whole massive thing about controls and the different types of controls that people were using. I just sort of started off the survey with that one. But the big thing I wanted to know, what's actually real? I mean, you hear a lot of FUD out there in the industry about what could go wrong or the types of things that might happen to anybody that's going and provisioning assets out into the cloud, but does it really come true? Is it just us, sort of fear-mongering, or are there really cases where people are experiencing breaches and significant types of intrusions, or is it just things that people are concerned with, or some combination of both? And sure enough, as you could probably expect, it was a bit of a combination. So back in 2017, we sort of saw that unauthorized access was close to the top of the list of actual problems that people were having, or some of the concerns that they were at least worried about. Same thing here. But the second one was the biggest change. So that's what really changed, in fact, this year was instead of going and looking at the seventh position where inability to respond to incidents was sort of way down. People really hadn't gotten to a point where they were worried about that much yet. Now, they're really worried about this. Like, this is a significant change just to see people acknowledging the fact that traditional ways of handling incidents or responding to incidents that they might have been pretty comfortable with on premise haven't necessarily translated as well. And I know there's going to be some discussion about that today and some of the other talks that are going on. I think, in fact, in just having conversations in the industry, that tends to bubble to the surface a lot. I don't feel like I can take my incident response methods, tools, some combination of both, out into the cloud and have them be as effective as I would like them to be. So that's another thing that I'll talk about in just a little bit more detail here in a moment. Other concerns, just lack of visibility into data, and then, of course, the unauthorized access to data from other cloud tenants. This whole notion that you might be in a bad neighborhood and you don't know it. So, who are your neighbors in the cloud? You have no idea unless you go sign up for a single tenancy option, which for any of you that have actually explored that option, it's like, I don't know, 1,000 times more expensive. So typically businesses are like, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to go sign up for the multi-tenant option. But what the multi-tenant option does is it puts you into the swamp. And you're wholly reliant on the cloud provider to maintain things like segmentation of memory and CPU processing and disk isolation for storage. That's a trust factor that we have to get used to, but it doesn't mean that people aren't worried about it. So there's still some concern about how that's being addressed and how the providers themselves are ensuring that our data and all of our other types of processing are being kept isolated and separate. So downtime was definitely something people saw. I mean, just in terms of the things that actually came true versus those people were just worried about. Downtime, sure, of course, you're going to see some downtime. There is no such thing as a 100% uptime situation. I've actually seen some offered SLAs from providers that guarantees that. But you should go into those arrangements knowing that you are being lied to. And again, I'll sign off on that if I'm the CIO, because you're going to give me contractual guarantees of service payments and other things. But there is no such thing as 100%, and so forth. I love the S3 resilience SLA from Amazon. Anybody know what that is off the top of their head? 11 nines. Just go on ahead and let that one sit there for a minute. I mean, why not make it 12? Seriously, at that point, who cares? But 11 nines is just hugely unrealistic. But I'll take it. All right, I'll sign up for it. Anyway, back to this. Things that actually happen. Downtime's going to happen. Biggest change was an actual case of people being breached. So we did see unauthorized access by outsiders sort of creeping up here. Again, we only had 12% of people say that happened in our last survey, 28%. So, I mean, over doubled for sure. And what does that say? Don't know. That's the thing. There's still some question marks around that because what we don't necessarily know is all the details behind why that's occurring in the first place. I don't want to make any assumptions that it's because the cloud providers are doing anything negligent at all. In fact, more than likely, it's because people are putting more stuff into the cloud and they don't know what they're doing, and they're probably misconfiguring things. We definitely saw more people say that API misconfigurations were occurring. And that's because we're using more APIs, which I'll get to here in a moment as well. So the good news for us, though, just to take that into context, only 10% really said, hey, we know it happened. So even though you say, well, we did see an uptick in this, we definitely did see some people saying they experienced breaches. We only saw 10% that were willing to, sort of put their stamp on it and say, yeah, absolutely, we really did see it happen. I like the, the red and green options, right? Like, so 72% were like, not that we know of. Well, that's my nice way of saying, you don't have to really admit it if you don't want to. Some people, even on an anonymous survey, are wholly uncomfortable telling you they've had a real security problem. Maybe they thought we were tracking them or something, I don't know. But I like that some people were at least honest and said, yeah, we did have a problem. And in the red here, you can see another 10% that said, yeah, we can't really prove it, but we think we had some issues. And that goes back to not having enough detail or data around the response efforts themselves. This is the closest I could get to nailing down what actually happened in those cases. Remember, it's not a lot of cases, only 10% that really said yes. But in that 10%, number one, and I love this because it's what everybody knows, it's account credential hijacking, right? Have you guys seen this movie before? Do you know how it ends? Yeah, we know how it ends, right? The keeping up with credentials is like the gift that keeps on giving because it implies that we don't really have a good handle on accounts in the first place. And we know we don't have a good handle on accounts in the first place. So that has made its way into the cloud. The other one is misconfiguration. So people that are screwing up their configs, people that are not managing their accounts or tracking their accounts as well as they would probably like to. And then coming in third, it's privileged user abuse or privileged user something. And that might imply DevOps, that might imply service accounts, it might imply cloud administrators or engineers, anybody that has more access to cloud resources than others. But none of those really surprise me at all. There's nothing that stands out to me in those responses that is super sophisticated or really that different from the same old problems that we're experiencing in-house, which is very encouraging for me as a security professional because what it means is these are the problems we know. We know these problems. We simply have to adapt our strategies to be able to handle them in the cloud. And there were some awesome talks given yesterday about access management and the challenges that go along with that. And so this is something that is very apparently happening across the board, not only from the end user side, but from the administration side as well. And especially when you start developing automated or semi-automated pipelines, you really got to make sure security is embedded in that at all layers so that you don't inadvertently automate your way to problems as well. So this is something that I really enjoyed sort of seeing the responses come in as things that weren't unexpected. We tried to find out what kinds of things people were using controls-wise. And there's a litany of controls that are out there, and I probably could have gone into a ton more detail on any one of these. I'm not going to go into all the specifics around all of these different controls. I do have a few things to sort of pull out of this here in just a moment. But if you look across the board here, I think what you're seeing consistently is two sort of major themes. Number one, I think a lot of people are still trying to manage this from in-house. I think they're still trying to use the same old tools, the same old types of controls, and then sort of, I don't want to borrow a term from yesterday that we sort of, bashed a little bit, but the whole lift and shift. Sometimes you can't necessarily lift and shift your security controls either. Now, and I think a lot of people are still trying to do that. But what's encouraging are these security as a service and both sort of options that are coming in the green and the blue bars, in particular in a couple different areas. Things like vulnerability scanners. I mean, look, vulnerability scanning is something that we've sort of just accepted as a core control today. Everybody's got some of this. And it's all the usual suspects. Fortunately, all of them have made their way to the cloud. If you listed the major vendors in that space, every single one of them has a cloud native or cloud compatible option. Cool, we're starting to make use of that. People have gotten comfortable with the idea of moving some of those things out. Same thing goes to some of these other areas, right? Like intrusion detection prevention, sort of, still a lot of in-house management of that. You look over here at examples of things like log and event management, which people were talking about yesterday, and there were some awesome discussions of that. In particular, the WASA stuff that you guys gave, an awesome talk on, thank you very much. Complete adaptability to cloud versus trying to do it on premise. So a couple key takeaways that I got out of here, still being managed internally. We saw some growth in CASBs, encryption gateways, definitely some identity management, but altogether, I still really am hoping to see more people start moving things out into either a hybrid model or even a wholly cloud native model and sort of just get out of this mindset that we've got to take the traditional stuff and just hope for the best to make it work. Sometimes it can. I'm not saying that all those controls are dead, but a lot of them just don't quite work the way people had thought that they would. The good news too, people are at least accepting the fact that cloud is here to stay. And that's what I take away from people having policies and having somewhat of a governance strategy in place. In fact, if you sort of pressed me on it, most of the year as a consultant, what I tend to do is go take a look at people's cloud configurations, architecture, programs in general. And most of the problems, the biggest problems, aren't in the technical arena. There's definitely those problems too. It's people that just sort of ran to get there but didn't put that back-end policy and overall plan in place as to how people were going to work together and get the job done consistently over time. That's governance. It's not an exciting topic. In fact, it's a very fast way to repel people from you at cocktail parties. But nonetheless, just be aware that the good news is people are realizing this. So we saw an uptick of some of this. The thing that I really was unhappy to see was, in my opinion, the number of people leveraging things like APIs and implementing security controls through more programmatic methods, it's just not as high as I want to see. For people that are getting out there, I'd like to see that number way up. And I know Ben talked a little bit about that yesterday, just in our panel. The idea of using software-driven mechanisms to implement your security controls, it's not a nice to have, it's a must have. It's something that absolutely has to occur if we're going to get there. And we're just not seeing people use this stuff as much as they should. So the good news is at least some of them are. So the people that are using CSP APIs, configuration management right there. So people are tying into deployment mechanisms, leveraging images and templates. They're also defining a lot of this in security as code or infrastructure as code, which is nice to see as well. Logging and event management. I would actually go so far as to say you're never going to get there in getting all the logs and events that you need out of the cloud providers without tying into APIs somewhere. You're going to have to go make some queries. You're going to have to tap into this and siphon it out somehow to something. You just really can't do that without leveraging some of the cloud native tooling. that has been made available by the large providers. Identity and access management is another one. So you can see, sort of a consistent theme that people are applying here. It's defining assets and infrastructure core controls. It's managing identities across the board. And then I think also just dealing with events from a security perspective has become such a pressing issue that people are acknowledging that they're starting to explore the better ways to go about getting that data and pull it out and start making use of it. So looking at some of the controls integration, I don't know how I feel about some of the network stuff here, because I think it could be open to interpretation. My general experience in taking traditional network control definitions and network architectural definitions and bringing them out to cloud is that people haven't done a very good job of it. In fact, this is one place that I hear a lot of complaints for people that say, well, I sort of expected to be able to bring my traditional firewall architecture or my traditional, sort of routing, switching, et cetera models with me. In the cloud, good luck finding a switch. It's just not there for you, right? Layer 2 is no longer, really part of your situation. Well, what does that mean? It means that if you had been relying wholly on some stuff at layer 2, it's time to move on. You better figure out some new ways to do things. So this one, I'm interested to see over the course of the next couple of years how it shakes out, to see whether people really feel as though they're doing this the right way. Network traffic analysis is extraordinarily difficult in infrastructure as a service environments. If you take a look at what you've traditionally done in-house with things like taps or inline types of monitoring or things like port mirroring or span ports on switches, it's really hard to get that stuff. It's just not easy to do. I'm not saying there aren't options, but it's really challenging, and my experience is that most people really haven't done this. So I'm not sure how I feel about that top one, but we'll see. People do feel like they've integrated their SIMs. People are starting to integrate some of the endpoint types of tools, which is expected, especially if people feel the need to have that endpoint detection capability, or call it next-gen AV, whatever you want to, in place. You can still install things into instance workloads in the cloud. It's not always a great idea because of the overhead that comes along with that, but at least in some cases, you can if you're willing to pay for the overage that comes with it. So I'm, again, encouraged to see that people are at least sort of moving in that direction and taking some of the things they need to at least get there. Multi-factor authentication. Wow, what a shocker. Over 60% said they're actually doing that. We've only been yelling about this for decades, so it's finally nice to see that people are at least acknowledging that it is a core control that needs to happen. I'm not so sure. These people that are the next 12 months, I'm like, what are you doing out there? Right? You shouldn't be there, right? Don't leave, don't leave the house yet. You guys aren't ready. You don't have your clothes on. But the next things you go across the board and look at, the things that people are doing or sort of saying they're planning on doing, it's all the traditional types of tools that you would expect. It's those things that we've sort of looked at and said, okay, what are the major elements of this? And so, like, for instance, the next one that's sort of the big one here, it is vulnerability scanning. Yeah, it's almost 60% said they're pretty comfortable. They've got that integrated. The next one down from that is anti-malware. So for people that need it, and let's face it, half the people that have to say they have anti-malware, it might be a compliance checkbox as much as anything else. You have those tools, whether that's Azure giving you some sort of a native integration with Defender, whether that's name a vendor that has a product in the marketplace that you can integrate in. We have seen the adaptation of that tooling to accommodate for cloud. So it's no longer an excuse, in other words, to be able to say, hey, if I have to have anti-malware, I can't go to the cloud because I can't get it. No, it's actually out there. What we didn't see, though, was a consistent application of a single vendor solution. And I wouldn't say that's necessarily a problem, unless you're in a multi-cloud scenario where it's just the operational overhead of trying to manage a bunch of stuff. That might be a huge headache. So what this tells you is that people are finding some application of single vendor options. Again, anti-malware seems to be pretty good. You see the vulnerability scanning is pretty good, but after that, it's sort of all over the place. So I think people are having to explore new options, whether that's in-cloud stuff, whether that's sort of new cloud-native options that they hadn't had before. This is one of the big areas that we've really focused in on over the course of the past couple of years in our surveys, is really getting down to the artifacts that people want or need as part of their investigations. Some of these things I think you can do pretty easily. Like I said, vulnerability scanning, not that tough. You can pull that off. But as soon as you say, well, what do you traditionally need, right? If you talk about traditional forensics practices today, what do you traditionally need in order to feel as though you've got that covered? And so, as a starting list, it might be things like disk acquisition, it might be memory acquisition, it's probably things like network traffic and PCAPs or whatever format you might need for a collection of data. And then it's probably things like event data in whatever form as a starting point. Can you get that, and can you, in fact, put a process in place that allows you to sort of match up or accommodate for what you've traditionally done? In some cases, we got responses back, and people said, yeah, we feel like we can. In a lot of cases, the answer was absolutely not. And especially when you start bringing in these really complicated problems like chain of custody or legal types of access or law enforcement scrutiny or oversight of some of these types of situations, I think people really aren't comfortable with a lot of this yet. Now, I know Ken's going to be giving a great talk a little bit later today about how to go about actually getting some of this stuff. And so it's exciting to see we're getting there. I think there is some significant movement on this front. But a lot of people said that they were really challenged by this. They really felt that they couldn't get real-time visibility into some of this. They felt that their processes were immature. And by the way, that holds water in what I have seen out there. In fact, if I go and let's say you guys were one big organization, if the couple folks over there were the SOC and the forensics and the IR team, they might not have had hardly any time to really sort of adapt their processes to cloud, build out those sort of workflows and playbooks and really get their hands in the stuff. And right there is where it all breaks. Because if your IR team doesn't know how to use your cloud infrastructure, the way I look at this is AWS is a skill. Azure is a skill. Google Cloud is a skill. And the worst time to figure out a new skill is in the middle of a firestorm. So those folks need that time. They've got to get in there and they've got to start learning where that forensic evidence is and what it looks like. And we went down the list and saw some additional challenges people cited as well. Just lack of access to some of the low-level data, inability to correlate some of the things, which I saw some great discussion of yesterday. I think we're starting to figure that out. In other words, look at the CloudTrail events. I mean, there's an enormous litany of event types that are available to you. I personally think they're pretty well named myself. I've spent a lot of time with this, right? Like disable multi-factor. Like, okay, well, I can probably figure out what's going on there, right? Or stop logging. Wonder what's actually happening there. Those are things that I think make some sense, but you got to know them. And you got to take those and tie them to other event data and other things that are occurring. So I think that is just a matter of time. But that inability to maintain chain of custody, compatibility issues with forensics tools that people have been used to and comfortable with, I think that's probably going to be a continuing problem over time. This definitely stood out as a problem. And I can sum up this slide in probably one generic Shackleford statement. Most security people don't understand identity management. It's just a fact of life. It's not a knock. I'm not pointing fingers. I typically find identity and access management, in particular like identity policy, that is broader in scope. I'm not talking about authentication and multi-factor and all that. It's all part of this too. But when you start getting into legit fine-grained role definitions that have to encompass things like application tier access and so forth, that's not something that a lot of security people have spent a lot of time on, and it needs to be. And that's really where one of the big headaches comes in. It's just this feeling that, we haven't gotten there. Yeah, I would agree we haven't gotten there, but we will, because you cannot do this without having significant identity and access controls across the spectrum. In fact, I'm sure some of you will have heard this whole adage in the industry today that identity is the new perimeter. I sort of don't agree. I think the perimeter is still the perimeter, but the definition of what the perimeter is necessarily shifting to be a little more encompassing of things that are more identity-based. So we'll see more of this. This is a place that I have a lot of faith that improvements will occur, just in the sense, if you look at the green bar here, the fact that people have gotten comfortable integrating in-house directory services. If I asked security teams 10 years ago, hey, how would you guys feel about just taking your Active Directory, throwing it out into the cloud? People would have looked at me like I had 3 heads. Now, granted, of course, I'm being a little exaggerant here. But the idea is, you almost can't do some of this without it. You've got to get comfortable with your identities and the representation of said identities being a bit more extensible than they have in the past in one way or another. And that's just a part of it, right? The other piece is more object and asset-based identity. Everything in the cloud is an asset, and every asset can have an identity, whether that's server workloads, whether that's containers, whether that's users, whether that's groups, whether that's role assignments for services communicating amongst each other. That is all identity, and that is something security teams are definitely finding they've got to get more control of. This is another place that I have high hopes, right? The whole idea of automation and orchestration as a generic topic is one that we really can't avoid in any discussion of cloud security. In fact, one of the things that I was really encouraged to hear in some of the presentations yesterday is that there's emphasis on this. In fact, we're trying to get away from manual activities wherever possible. Nobody wants to go in and click their way to glory. You know, it's just not the recipe for success. So you got to figure out more automated workflows and scriptable methods and really just use the tooling that's in place, hopefully within the cloud providers themselves, to accommodate for this. So it's, of course, things like Terraform and CloudFormation and Azure, Resource Manager templates, the whole infrastructure as code concept. It's things like serverless technology. So again, really cool to see almost half of the respondents have started making use of things like serverless. Now, the dark secret of serverless, and that's an intro to our next topic, which is coming up after me, is that there is still actually a server. It's just not one you have any access to. So you gotta have some at least acknowledgement of that. But configuration orchestration, plugins for things like Jenkins and other DevOps pipeline tools, we're starting to move in this direction. And so it's good news. Again, I'd love to see those numbers be a little bit higher. In fact, I'd really love to see, if nothing else on this list was sort of standing out to me, I really was hoping I would have seen a significantly higher number on this purple bar, the use of configuration orchestration tools like Ansible or Puppet or Chef or any of those. Not necessarily because we're always moving directly into the immutable infrastructure mindset, although that's great if you can, but just because we need better consistency in management and oversight of some of that. This is also good news for us, I think, right? And the good news here, first off, and this hasn't been reflected in what you see here, so Amazon was the final holdout, really, on sort of controlling penetration testing into their infrastructure as a service environment, and they still do, but they sort of opened up most of the major services just a few months ago, which was huge, which was a massive change in their policy going back years and years. So if you're in any one of the large infrastructure as a service provider environments, for the most part, you can do pen tests when you need to do pen tests, which is awesome, which is huge for organizations that want and need to do that. The thing that has to sort of come in here, though, is that, remember, infrastructure as a service does not equal all cloud. So as soon as you bring in platform services and SaaS, many of them don't allow you to do pen tests still, and so that number is going to stay up here. You're certainly going to see people still struggling to be able to pull off pen tests, at least in some cases. But we also asked about things like audits. I don't think I've ever had a case where any of the large cloud providers invited me to come hang out on premise with them. You're probably not going to get an invite to go hang out at an Amazon data center or Google data center. Although I was actually just over in Europe a few months ago, and apparently the European Financial Commission over there does have some cloud, and there are rumors of getting some on-premise audit invites that I can't validate. I just sort of heard this secondhand. But nonetheless, most of what we have to rely on are the audit reports that are provided by the providers themselves, the attestation reports in whatever form, whether that's Cloud Security Alliance, whether that's ISO, whether that's a SOC 2 report, which are riveting, by the way, those reports. They're giving us at least some intel on what these guys are saying they're doing. Are you willing to trust them? That's a decision that only you can make. So this is a subjective conversation in that regard. To finish up, right? The whole idea, takeaways from the survey this year, we're seeing a lot of growing cloud use, as anybody could expect. We're seeing more willingness to put sensitive data into the cloud, and we're most definitely seeing some areas of frustration, but that doesn't mean there aren't encouraging points to take away from this. We're seeing people get comfortable with automation. We're seeing people get comfortable with some of the security service offerings that are available in the cloud themselves. We're seeing more and more organizations starting to use hybrid solutions. Places I'd like to see improvement, definitely around API use, definitely around automation, all the way around. I think that's stuff that it's just going to take some time for security folks to get comfortable with, but it's coming. And thanks for listening to me.